Until the lion learns to write, every story will glorify the hunter. That's the problem with history. It's usually told by the ones who won. That old saying couldn't be more true, especially when it comes to Hollywood's version of history. For decades, the film industry has shaped how people see the world, turning real-life events into larger-than-life myths. And when it comes to Native Americans, Hollywood has done a terrible job. Think about it. Suppose your knowledge of Native American history comes from movies. In that case, you probably picture feathered warriors on horseback, mystical elders speaking in riddles, or silent, brooding figures watching from the shadows. Maybe you imagine them all living in teepees, bloody savages, or vanishing into history as the civilized world took over. But here's the thing. None of that is completely true. Hollywood has been feeding the world a fantasy for over a century, turning Indigenous people into one-dimensional characters instead of real people with real history. The problem is that when these myths are repeated, they start to feel like facts. Most people don't question them because they've seen them in every movie. But Native American history is way more complex, diverse, and interesting than Hollywood ever lets on. The truth is filled with powerful leaders, thriving cities, and cultures that adapted, innovated, and resisted colonization in ways that movies never show. So it's time to flip the script. Today, we're breaking down the biggest Hollywood myths about Native Americans and exposing how wrong they really are. Some myths have existed since the first silent films, while others still appear in modern movies. Either way, they share one thing: none tell the full truth. But first, if you want to know more about Native Americans and the Old West, kindly like and subscribe to our channel. Thanks for joining us again. Okay, let's begin with the noble savage myth. First, let's discuss the noble savage stereotype. You've seen it a million times. Native Americans in movies are either wise, mystical guides with cryptic one-liners, or fierce, silent warriors who stare dramatically into the sunset. It's always one extreme or the other. Take The Last of the Mohicans. The native characters in that film are portrayed as noble, but doomed-like. Their only purpose is to assist the white hero before tragically disappearing into history. And then there's the classic Disney version of Pocahontas, where she's basically a woodland fairy who exists to make John Smith a better man. Real Native American cultures are way more complex than Hollywood makes them out to be. There were hundreds of tribes, each with different languages, traditions, and ways of life. But movies love to paint them all with the same broad brush. Mystical nature lovers who speak in riddles, or stoic warriors who never smile. Even in modern films, this stereotype still shows up. You'll see native characters appearing as wise mentors or shamans, always guiding the white protagonist on some deep spiritual journey. Like, come on, Hollywood. Native Americans aren't side characters in someone else's story. The myth of universal hostility towards settlers. If you've watched any classic Western movie, you've probably seen the same tired plot. Pioneers bravely heading west, only to be ambushed by a horde of screaming Native Americans. Hollywood has drilled this into our heads for decades. Native Americans were always hostile to settlers, and every encounter was a life-or-death battle. But that's far from the truth. European settlers who first arrived in North America weren't met with universal resistance. In fact, many Native American tribes helped them survive. The Wampanoag, for example, famously aided the Pilgrims in Plymouth, teaching them how to farm local crops and navigate their new environment. Without that help, the settlers might not have survived their first brutal winters. Another major flaw in Hollywood storytelling is the assumption that all Native American tribes had the same reaction to settlers. In reality, different tribes had different approaches, and even within the same tribe, there were varying opinions on how to deal with European newcomers. Take the Cherokee, for example. They adopted many European customs for much of the 18th and early 19th centuries, including written language, farming techniques, and even a constitutional government. They believed assimilation and cooperation were the best ways to ensure their survival. On the other hand, tribes like the Comanche and Apache, who had long histories as warrior societies, were more resistant to European encroachment. But even within those groups, some individuals and factions sought peaceful relations. The idea that every Native American was immediately hostile to settlers ignores the complexities of these societies. One of the biggest things Hollywood leaves out is the fact that Native Americans often fought alongside European settlers and armies. During the American Revolutionary War, the Mohawk, Seneca, and other tribes allied with the British, while some tribes like the Oneida sided with the American colonists. During the War of 1812, Native Americans were key players on both sides. The Shawnee leader Tecumseh formed a massive indigenous confederacy to resist American expansion, aligning with the British in hopes of securing land for his people. Meanwhile, other tribes supported the United States, believing it would benefit them in the long run. Even during conflicts like the Indian Wars of the 19th century, some tribes allied with the U.S. government against rival tribes. The Pawnee, for instance, worked as scouts for the U.S. Army and fought against their traditional enemies, the Lakota. These alliances complicate the idea that Native Americans were universally opposed to settlers, if you're wondering why so many Native tribes ended up at war with settlers. In that case, the answer isn't as simple as they hated newcomers. A huge part of the hostility came from broken treaties and land encroachment. Time and time again, Native American leaders agreed to peace treaties, only for the U.S. government to ignore them when it was convenient. Land that was promised to indigenous nations was taken away, sometimes within years of a treaty being signed. The most famous example is the Treaty of Fort Laramie, 1868, which guaranteed the Lakota ownership of the Black Hills. However, once gold was discovered there, the U.S. government took the land anyway, leading to wars like the Battle of Little Bighorn. When peace agreements were ignored, Native leaders had few choices. They could either accept the loss of their land and way of life or fight back. Many chose the latter, but it was often a last resort after years of deception. Hollywood, however, skips that part and jumps straight to the action-packed battle scenes. Hollywood's version of history is convenient. It creates clear heroes, villains, and good and bad guys. But real history isn't that simple. By reducing indigenous peoples to an always hostile force, Hollywood ignores their agency, diplomacy, and adaptability. Native Americans only existed in the past. Here's another big myth Hollywood has pushed for decades: the idea that Native Americans disappeared. Like, poof, gone, never to be seen again. If you watched enough old westerns, you'd think Native Americans only existed in the 1800s and that once the cowboys took over, they just faded into history. But that couldn't be further from the truth. Native Americans are still here. They're not relics of the past. They're living, thriving communities shaping modern society in politics, business, science, activism, sports, and entertainment. There are over 7 million Native Americans in the U.S. today, representing 574 federally recognized tribes, plus countless others fighting for recognition. Yet, Hollywood rarely shows this. Instead, it keeps Native Americans trapped in the past, as if they only exist in dusty history books or old black and white photos. This myth isn't just inaccurate, it's harmful. By acting like Native Americans vanished, Hollywood fuels ignorance, making it easier to erase Indigenous voices from modern conversations. It also affects real-world policies, where people assume Native issues no longer exist because, according to movies, neither do Native people. When was the last time you saw a Native American character living their life in a modern setting? Not as a warrior, a wise elder, or some mystical guide, but as a doctor, a lawyer, a teacher, a business owner, or even a regular person dealing with everyday life. Not often, because Hollywood doesn't tell those stories. Even today, mainstream movies rarely cast Native actors in contemporary roles. When they include Native characters, they're usually stuck in historical settings, reinforcing the idea that Native Americans belong to the past. But the reality? Native cultures are alive, evolving, and more resilient than ever. They didn't disappear. Hollywood just stopped looking. The one-size-fits-all myth. All right, this one's both frustrating and kind of hilarious. Hollywood has completely butchered Native American languages for years. Instead of, accurately portraying the many real Indigenous languages that exist, movies often go for gibberish. Classic Westerns are notorious for this. Instead of hiring native speakers, directors would have actors either speak in broken English or make up nonsense words that sound native, but are completely fake. Some films even went as far as playing English backward to make it sound tribal. Yes, really. And then there's the slow, overly dramatic way native characters are often made to speak in movies. You know the type. Long pauses, overly simple words like they're struggling with basic English. This plays into the harmful stereotype that Native Americans were primitive or unintelligent, which is absolutely not true. Native American languages are some of the most complex in the world. For example, the Navajo language was so sophisticated that it was used as an unbreakable military code during World War II. Hollywood could easily do better, but for years, it's been stuck in this lazy, inaccurate portrayal of native languages. The headdress myth. Let's discuss Hollywood's most overused costume piece. The feathered headdress. You've seen it in every Western Halloween costume store and even at music festivals, where people should not wear it. Thanks to Hollywood, many people think every Native American wore a massive feathered war bonnet, like they were all chiefs. Reality check. Not every tribe used them. In fact, war bonnets were mostly worn by specific plains tribes like the Lakota and Cheyenne. They weren't everyday fashion statements. They were sacred symbols of honor and leadership earned through acts of bravery. You couldn't just throw one on like a baseball cap. But in movies, every native character, no matter their tribe, gets slapped with a headdress like it's part of a uniform. Even films that are supposed to be historically accurate mess this up. Take The Lone Ranger. They had Johnny Depp, who isn't native, playing Tonto, wearing a completely made-up costume that was nowhere near accurate. That bird on the head look? Yeah, it's pure Hollywood nonsense. And let's not forget all the old westerns where native characters wear war bonnets while riding into battle. That didn't happen. Those headdresses weren't for fighting. They were for ceremonies. Warriors in battle wore lighter headgear or nothing at all because, let's be real, you're not going to charge into a fight with a giant feathered crown bouncing around on your head. Hollywood loves to incorporate headdresses into every native-themed scene because they're instantly recognizable to audiences. But in doing that, it erases the diversity of native cultures. It turns a deeply meaningful symbol into nothing more than a prop, the Hollywood war cry of Native Americans. You know that classic Native American war cry sound? The high-pitched woo-woo-woo noise you hear in old westerns whenever Native warriors appear on screen? Yeah, that's completely made up. If you've ever seen an old cowboy movie, you know exactly what I'm talking about. A group of native warriors rides over a hill, and suddenly they all start making that exaggerated war cry, usually while patting their mouths with their hands. It's been used in cartoons, commercials, and even sports stadiums. But here's the thing, it's not an actual Native American battle cry. It was a Hollywood invention. Native tribes had different ways of signaling during battle. Some used war songs, others used whistles, and some used drum beats. But that dramatic woo-woo-woo sound, nope. It was created by Hollywood sound designers who needed a quick and easy way to signal, "Here come the Indians," in a scene. Once it caught on, it became one of movie history's most overused sound effects. Even today, people still associate that fake sound with Native Americans, despite it having zero cultural or historical accuracy. It's one of those things repeated so many times in pop culture that people assume it must be true. But in reality, it's another way Hollywood has reduced diverse native cultures into a one-size-fits-all stereotype. Scalping myth. Time to tackle one of Hollywood's bloodiest and most persistent myths. Scalping. If you've seen any old Western, you know exactly what I'm talking about. The scene usually goes like this. A group of fierce native warriors attacks a group of settlers, and once they take someone down, they pull out a knife and take their scalp as a trophy. Sounds brutal, right? Well, here's the thing. Hollywood loves to exaggerate history, and this is one of the biggest distortions. While some Native American tribes did practice scalping, they weren't the only ones, and they definitely didn't invent it. In fact, European colonists were some of the worst offenders when it came to scalping. That's right. Early European settlers actually placed bounties on Native American scalps. At different points in history, the British, French, Spanish, and American governments encouraged the practice by offering money in exchange for scalps. This wasn't about warrior tradition, it was about wiping out native populations and profiting from it. But Hollywood? Nope, they flipped the script. Instead of showing scalping as something settlers and soldiers also did, they turned it into a brutal, savage practice that only Native Americans were guilty of. That's why, in movies, Native characters are almost always shown scalping white settlers. Still, you rarely see it happening the other way around. It's a one-sided, misleading version of history that made Native Americans look like ruthless aggressors while ignoring what actually happened. Even modern films haven't completely ditched this myth. Every time a movie wants to show a savage or brutal native warrior, they throw in a scalping scene. It's dramatic, it's shocking, and, unfortunately, it's totally inaccurate. Native Americans all lived in teepees. Picture a Native American village in a Hollywood movie. What do you see? Probably a wide-open prairie with a bunch of teepees in a circle, right? That's the go-to image Hollywood uses for Native American life. But here's the problem. Only some tribes lived in teepees. Teepees were used by Plains tribes like the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Blackfeet because they were nomadic and needed portable homes that could be packed up and moved easily. But most other tribes? They lived in completely different kinds of homes. The Iroquois and Huron built longhouses, large permanent wooden structures that could house multiple families. The Cherokee lived in wattle and dumb houses made from wood, clay, and straw. The Pueblo people built adobe houses, multi-story structures made of clay bricks that looked more like apartment buildings than anything else. Tribes in the Pacific Northwest had massive cedar plank houses. But Hollywood doesn't care about that. They slap a teepee on every native character's home, no matter where or when the movie is set. Even in films that take place in areas where teepees never existed, there they are because Hollywood decided that all Native Americans must have lived the same way. It's lazy storytelling, but it also erases the architectural genius and cultural diversity of indigenous tribes. Native Americans adapted to their environments incredibly smartly, building homes suited to their climates and needs. But Hollywood simplifies everything to plains, horses, and teepees, as if every tribe was the same. The myth of the silent, mysterious native. You've seen this character 1,000 times in movies. The quiet, brooding Native American who barely speaks, stares into the distance like he's always thinking about something deep, and only opens his mouth to drop a few words of wisdom before disappearing into the mist. Hollywood loves this trope. It makes native characters seem mystical, connected to nature, and somehow above the trivial chatter of regular people. But here's the problem. This whole idea is ridiculous. Native American cultures are incredibly diverse, and their people have never been some kind of silent, mystical monks. In reality, many Native communities have strong oral traditions filled with storytelling, humor, and debate. There are entire traditions built around joking, yes, joking. Some tribes even had designated figures called contraries or heyoka in the Lakota tradition, who acted in humorous opposite ways to teach lessons. But does Hollywood show this? Nope. They prefer the strong, silent native who never laughs, never jokes, and barely speaks. Even when movies show native characters talking, they're often given slow, dramatic lines that make them sound like they only speak in riddles and metaphors. Think about how often a native character in a movie has said something like, "The wind speaks to those who listen," or "You must follow the path of the eagle." That's not how people talk. But Hollywood loves making native characters sound like they deliver ancient prophecies instead of having regular conversations. It's an outdated, oversimplified stereotype that robs native characters of personality, humor, and depth. One with nature trope. Let's talk about another favorite Hollywood cliché, the idea that Native Americans were all peaceful, nature-worshipping environmentalists who lived in perfect harmony with the land. You know the scene. A native elder stands on a mountaintop, gazing out at the wilderness, and says something about honoring Mother Earth. Meanwhile, the white settlers show up and start cutting down trees, ruining the land, and ignoring the wise warnings of the native people. Don't get it twisted. Many Native American cultures have deep spiritual connections to the land. Respect for nature is a huge part of indigenous traditions. But Hollywood takes this idea and turns it into a stereotype, making it seem like every single Native American lived like a real-life Disney princess, speaking to the animals and never disturbing the land. The truth is that Native societies shaped the environment in major ways. They practiced controlled burns to manage forests, built large agricultural societies, and reshaped landscapes. The Mississippian culture built huge cities like Cahokia with massive earthworks. The Iroquois Confederacy practiced large-scale farming, clearing forests to grow crops. Tribes in the Southwest engineered sophisticated irrigation systems to grow food in the desert. But Hollywood? They ignore all that and act like Native Americans never altered the land. In contrast, Europeans were the only ones who built big civilizations. They romanticized Native people into some kind of mystical forest, guardians, instead of recognizing them as real people with advanced societies, agriculture, and engineering. This myth also erases the fact that Native Americans adapted to their surroundings in different ways. Some hunted buffalo, others farmed, some fished, and others built permanent cities. But Hollywood prefers the simplified version. Every Native character is a noble environmentalist who speaks in riddles and teaches the white man a lesson about respecting the earth, the stereotype of constant war. Hollywood loves a good fight scene. And unfortunately, that means Native Americans are often portrayed as either ruthless warriors or helpless victims of violence. But here's the thing. Many Native nations prioritize diplomacy over war. Movies make it seem like every indigenous group was in a constant battle, whether with other tribes or against settlers. But the truth is that most Native societies had complex political structures and diplomatic systems that focused on negotiation, trade, and alliances. War wasn't their defining characteristic. It was a last resort, not a lifestyle. Take the Iroquois Confederacy, for example. They created one of the oldest known democratic systems in the world, influencing even the U.S. Constitution. Their Great Law of Peace emphasized unity among different nations. War was only considered after all peaceful options had been exhausted. Even when conflicts did arise, they weren't chaotic battles like Hollywood loves to show. Many tribes had specific rules for war, including avoiding civilian casualties and stopping conflict through peace agreements. In some cases, battles were highly ritualized, with structured combat rather than reckless violence. On the flip side, Hollywood also ignores the fact that Native Americans were often on the receiving end of brutal attacks. The Indian Wars, forced removals, and massacres like Wounded Knee weren't spontaneous battles. They were systematic violence against indigenous people. But in movies, those parts of history get conveniently left out, or worse, rewritten to make Native people the aggressors. Let's not forget the classic Westerns, in which Native Americans are depicted as mindlessly charging at settlers on horseback, getting taken down one by one. Real battles were strategic, and Native warriors were skilled tacticians. Some, like the Comanche, mastered horseback combat so much that they were considered among the best riders in history. So, the next time you see a film where every Native character is a war-hungry fighter, remember that many indigenous nations were known more for their peacemaking skills than their battle strategies. But Hollywood never lets a good stereotype go to waste. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe. See you in our next video.